Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of How to Live to 200. Today we have royalty on the show. It is the one and only Aubrey de Grey. The Wikipedia page on Aubrey is seriously impressive, and I highly recommend you check it out. But in short, he is a biomedical gerontologist, a computer scientist, an author, an entrepreneur, and even listed as an amateur mathematician. He is what you call a polymath. He's been advocating and advancing the whole longevity category for almost 20 years, and he literally wrote the book, Ending Aging. In this episode, I'm just trying to keep up. The pace is fast and the information pretty deep. Specifically, we discuss how we might remove senescent cells from our body, why Peter Thiel gave him $6 million, why he thinks the coming biological age will dwarf the dot-com boom for investors, and why he thinks most people are living in a pro-aging trance, which is holding us back from massive breakthroughs. In this episode, you really get the world according to Aubrey, which is interesting and exciting, especially nice delivered in his charming English accent. He is intent on inventing the future and the strategies necessary to deliver on maximum longevity. And now this is How to Live to 200. So Aubrey, I'm honored and humble to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I found it particularly fascinating doing some research here that on your Wikipedia page, it says, De Grey argues that the most fundamental knowledge needed to develop effective anti-aging medicine already exists and that the science is ahead of all the funding. Do you still believe that to be true?
Oh, yes. I mean, let's be a little careful with that because I think that things are changing quite fast right now. But I think that it's going to take another few years before we can really say that the level of enthusiasm in the field, especially in the private sector, has caught up to where it ought to be.
How do you think you'll know when it's caught up?
When people start putting money into companies that I don't think are at the top of the range of opportunities, when it gets like the poor era of the dot-com boom when it was too big and when companies that were really rather mediocre were still getting lots of money. I think we're a few years away from that.
If I gave you the opportunity to invest $5 million in 3 different companies, what companies would you choose? Or maybe what categories would you choose?
Right. I certainly can't, at this point, give a list of only 3 companies. If you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I could have probably got it down to about half a dozen companies, but it's already up around a few dozen. In terms of categories, well, it really comes down to the same kind of classification that we have in the non-profit side of all of this, namely what we fund at SENS Research Foundation, the 501c3 that I'm the chief scientist of. Namely, we are interested in rejuvenation, which I can define very simply as turning back the clock of aging rather than just slowing it down, repairing damage that the body has done to itself throughout life in the course of its normal operation, rather than simply making the body run more cleanly, so to speak.
And is there a company or companies that come to mind in that? Again, I'm giving you a blank checkbook right now to say you can invest in company X or company Y or company Z.
So there are a few companies that are really making waves in the wider investment conversation and media and so on, simply because they have done so extraordinarily well. The first one that always has to be mentioned is Biotechnology, which is focused on the elimination of one particular type of damage, the elimination of senescent cells, as they're called. And Unity have already reached a point of nearly $1 billion in valuation, more than $300 million in actual investment. And that is before they have even begun their first clinical trial. So that really tells you how far away this is, how far ahead this is of the standard biotech world. This is a sector that, as it emerges, the smartest investors are realizing that it is on its way to being by far the biggest industry that has ever existed. It will literally dwarf the dot-com boom. And, of course, that means that the calculations one needs to do in terms of the value propositions that one is presented with are rather different in terms of how much risk one should take and how early one should get in. So that's the company that always is kind of the poster child of the industry right now. But there are quite a few others coming up right now that are, doing the same kind of thing and are only a little bit behind. For example, one of our spin-outs, AgeX Therapeutics in upstate New York, has already received upwards of $20 million, and it's growing fast. It certainly needs more. But most of the companies that are in this space are just starting out. They've only existed for less than a couple of years, and they're still at the seed and Series A level. So if you gave me the kind of money that you're talking about, I would spread it around a lot more than 3 companies.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see this innovation happening, like physically around the planet? Are there particular hotspots?
Well, yes. Certainly Silicon Valley is one of the hotspots, as you might expect, because Silicon Valley is one fantastic place for doing any kind of emerging technology. There's the right culture here. It's got that kind of attitude to failure that is positive. Everywhere else in the world, really, if you try something and you fail, then the natural, the standard interpretation is that you're not very good. Whereas in the Bay Area, the standard interpretation is that you're courageous. You tried something that was so hard that you couldn't do it, so let's give you another chance. That I think is the thing that has underpinned for decades what made the Bay Area what it is. And of course, it's not only the Bay Area, but I feel that attitude is most highly concentrated in the Bay Area more than anywhere else in the world.
Do you see up and coming areas? I mean, you travel extensively. You've been working in this topic area for so long. Are there areas, countries, research-oriented universities around the world that you've sort of seen come on rapidly outside of Silicon Valley?
Well, let's talk about universities first, because we at SENS Research Foundation, we only do about 1/3 of our research in-house in our own laboratories in Mountain View. The rest is done by funding research at universities and institutes. So we obviously keep quite a close eye on what you're asking. And the simple way of saying it is that universities, especially the more Ivy League type ones, tend to be slower than we would like. They tend to have a great deal of baggage and bureaucracy. But at the same time, this is not the first time that they have been presented with serious money-making opportunities. They all have very established and sizable tech transfer operations. And so when we talk to these people about, for example, taking a project that we have funded and turning it into a startup company, then the conversation is, it's not a ridiculous conversation. It's a conversation between professionals. And we haven't ended up seeing too much difficulty. Then again, it could always go faster. Around the world, we are seeing the same thing. So, for example, a couple of the most important funds that have got involved in the longevity area over the past couple of years are in Germany and are doing a great deal of important stuff. One of those funds is bankrolled by just one very wealthy guy, who's also a major donor to the foundation. And the other one is really an agglomeration of more than a dozen family offices. So, there's lots of different ways to skin this cat.
Are you seeing the nature of who's investing in this space changing?
Yes. So it started out being completely uninvestable until maybe 4 years ago. The only way one could do this work properly was the way we do it, philanthropically, having a non-profit that is funded entirely by donations. The industry really only started to emerge 3 or 4 years ago. And initially, as you might expect, it was driven by the more angel types, the more high risk, high reward friendly investors with their own money to spend. But increasingly that is broadening out. I've heard recently that, in fact, a couple of years ago, it started to broaden out with one big investment from Andreessen Horowitz. And Felicis has also got involved over the past year or so. There's another big fund. A number of the other major entities in this space are starting to realize that now is the time to get on this train.
And I know that Peter Thiel actually gave you a significant check for the SENS Foundation. Maybe you could talk about the relationship there and or other people like Peter.
Totally. So Peter Thiel actually was our first donor, our first major donor, starting in 2006. Before that, we were struggling along on grassroots funding. Nobody had given us more than about $20,000 or $30,000, and Peter started giving us roughly $1 million per year. And of course, that transformed our ability to do stuff. It let me quit my part-time job in the University of Cambridge in England, among other things, and we started to do a lot of research. So actually, back then, I thought that things were going to get pretty easy funding-wise, because Peter was not only wealthy in his own right, he also had a huge reputation. That was the era in which his hedge fund, Clarion Capital, was literally the most high-performing hedge fund in the world. And it didn't work out that way. It took us ages, years, before we brought in any other seriously high net worth people. But it's a process. You've got to demonstrate results. You've got to show that you've got the right scientific plan. You've also got to show that you are the right people to execute that plan. And at the end of the day, when you're doing really early stage work, that takes time. So, I don't resent that, but it has worked out in the end.
Tell me more about the foundation, SENS.
So SENS Research Foundation is a 501c3, as I mentioned, a public charity, so it's tax efficient. And indeed, we have affiliates elsewhere in Canada and also in Europe, so that it's possible for people there to donate tax efficiently as well. And our budget still is very small. We only get by on $5 million a year, tiny amount of money, but we've done a lot with it over the years. We have deliberately worked on the most difficult problems in aging, because those are the problems that are simply neglected by other people. In industry, they are neglected because people who want to make money want to make it fast, and so they work on the low-hanging fruit. And in academia, unfortunately, the short-termism is just as strong for a completely different reason, namely that you have to get publications out in high-profile journals in order to get your next grant application funded through peer review. So we set ourselves up as an independent organization that was free of those constraints, and we therefore were able to work on things for years and years without even getting one publication. But when we finally did make breakthroughs, they were massive breakthroughs. So we have unlocked research avenues that people knew were the holy grail in specific areas of anti-aging research, but they were not working on them because they were too difficult. And we managed to make the breakthroughs, and now these areas are pursued and pursuable. And indeed, they are the sources of the companies that we have been spinning out into startups, having gestated them as projects within the foundation for all that time.
Well, obviously begs the question of what are the 2 or 3 areas that are the biggest discovery?
So, the first area that really got to the point of proof of concept where we could spin it out was the elimination of molecular waste products that accumulate inside cells. This is the basis of one or two of the, in fact several really, of the most important aspects of aging. So 2 great examples of that are atherosclerosis, which is of course the number 1 killer in the Western world, and macular degeneration, which is the number 1 cause of blindness in the elderly. In both cases, you've got cells synthesizing as byproducts of things they need to do, synthesizing molecules that they don't know what to do with. They can't break them down, they can't excrete them, and so those molecules just accumulate, slowly but surely, and eventually there's so much of the stuff that the cell gets unhappy. So our approach is to identify enzymes in other species, typically bacteria, that are able to break down these substances and then introduce the genes encoding those enzymes into human cells with suitable modifications so that they still work. And we succeeded in both of those examples I just mentioned, atherosclerosis and macular degeneration. These 2 cases, there's completely different molecules that you need to target, but the approach of identifying bacterial enzymes is identical. And in both cases, we were able to spin those things out into startups, which have done very well. Both of those things were able, of course, to attract considerably more financial support once they had been spun out, because so many investors are keen to make money back eventually rather than just give it away. And the result is those projects will both, I think, very likely be in clinical trials within the next year or 2.
And is that the category, just broadly speaking, of senescence?
Oh, goodness me, no. So what we have been saying, and what I've been saying since about the year 2000, is that the right way to think about aging is the elimination of damage in the body, the repair of the damage that the body does to itself in the course of its normal operation, starting even before we're born. But there are many different types of damage because, of course, the body is a really, really, really complicated machine. Now, the good news is that even though there are so many types of damage, you can classify them into a small number of categories for each of which there is a generic therapy. So the category of accumulation of waste products in the cell, which I just mentioned, is one of those categories. And I just mentioned the way that we go about eliminating it. But there are 6 other categories that we have to deal with. There's the accumulation of what are called senescent cells that don't have garbage in them, but they are misbehaving and not going away. There's cancer, which is the accumulation of cells that are dividing when they're not supposed to. There's having too few cells, because cells are dividing when are not dividing when they are supposed to, and that are dying and not being automatically replaced by stem cells or whatever. And then there are various other molecular problems as well. So we have a total of 7 categories, and we've worked on all of them, except for we haven't done very much work on loss of cells, on cells becoming depleted, because the fix for that is simply stem cell therapy, and that's an area that is extremely well dealt with by the industry in general. Unlike all the others, it's something that was already well established and respected and funded by other sources by the time we started our work. And so our contribution to that would have not been a good bang for the buck.
Going down the alley of senescence, play us forward 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the future. At what point does this become general common knowledge, and are therapies delivered where the average person is benefiting from this research?
Well, I would say it's going to become common knowledge well before these therapies become available to people, even to wealthy people. The fact is, I've been in the media and on stage, pretty much incessantly, ad nauseam for about 15 years now. I did 60 Minutes in 2006. I've been in high-profile media all this time. And so there's a lot of pent-up knowledge there, people kind of pretending that they don't know these things, but they actually do. And they're just waiting for the point where they can summon up the courage to get their hopes up that it's really going to come along in time for them. Now, I believe that we're very, very close to that at this point. The reason why the industry has started to come into existence over the past couple of years, and that is that more and more of these areas are getting to a sufficient stage of proof of concept that investors can join the dots. They can actually see a value proposition from where we are, albeit very early stage, out to profitability and products and all that. There's still a long way to go to get to those products, but that's what early stage investment is all about. And of course, we don't have to get everybody on side. We just have to get a critical mass of donors, investors, policymakers, opinion formers on side, and the rest will happen on its own.
What has changed in the environment over the last 3 years versus the last 15 to make this accelerate this?
It's really just reaching a tipping point. It's not any single thing. From the point of view of someone like myself, who's at the coalface of the actual science, actual research being done, there's essentially no difference. We're just plodding along, taking these tiny steps that science always proceeds by, and getting, putting things together one step at a time, one piece at a time. But at the same time, in parallel with doing the actual work at the bench, we are talking about it. And the more you talk about it, and the more you get away with it, and people don't say that you're talking nonsense, and the more that you do make those early stage steps, the more people start listening. And eventually people with deep pockets start listening. And so it goes.
Do you think that there's some enabling technologies which help accelerate the discovery? For example, computational biology, cloud services, machine learning applied better, et cetera?
Oh, yeah. A lot of enabling technologies have contributed here. That's one of them. And one of the most successful companies in this space is in silico medicine, which is using very much state-of-the-art machine learning technology to identify and to repurpose drugs for anti-aging purposes. But it's not just enabling technologies outside of biology, it's also within biology. So, for example, CRISPR, which everyone's heard of these days, this gene editing technology, is, a really amazing thing that is being used throughout the whole of medical research, and it's just as applicable in the anti-aging space as it is elsewhere. So we're certainly using it, everyone's using it, and the simple fact that things like CRISPR emerge has certainly played its part psychologically in in getting people to be able to think big.
For your research, how do you direct the dollars? How do you choose where to focus?
Well, the main thing that we do is we focus it on rejuvenation. So it's very important for us to be actually repairing damage, not just trying to slow down the rate at which the body generates more damage. That's got a couple of underlying reasons. The first reason is that clearly it's going to be more valuable. If you're already in middle age or older, and you've accumulated a lot of damage already, then just slowing down the rate at which you make more damage is not going to benefit you very much. Whereas if you can fix the damage that's already been created, then you're in a much better situation. The other thing that's very important here is the purely scientific fact that it seems that repairing damage is going to be a very great deal easier, just more feasible technologically than the slowing down of damage creation, because damage creation is so inextricably wound into the process of keeping us alive in the first place, the network of metabolic processes that proceed every day. So that's the first thing. The other thing that really determines our priorities is simply other people's priorities. In other words, we aim to ensure that nothing gets left behind, that the things that are being most neglected by other people, typically because they're so difficult, as I mentioned earlier, are able to catch up by virtue of the work that we do, that we fund, since we are not constrained in the same way that most other research organizations are.
If you take yourself back to 2005, 2006, and play it forward, what things have gone a lot faster and what things have gone a lot slower toward broad adoption?
Of course, on the science side, on the actual availability of medicines, really none of this is at the level of broad adoption yet, because, as I say, things are still early stage. They're just moving into clinical trials. But if we talk about broad adoption of the idea that these things are feasible, then I would say that the first thing that's gone more slowly than I would have expected, the main thing, is the interest from very wealthy technocrats. So, Peter Thiel came in 2006 and supported us quite substantially. But I spoke at TED in 2006, and the sort of conference that is. I've also spoken at Idea City and a number of other TED-like conferences over the years. So I've met pretty much everyone you can imagine who you might think would be interested in putting their own personal money into this kind of thing. And it just hardly anyone did. Every billionaire is different. They've got their own reasons not to do these things. But the fact is, I was very, very surprised because of a lot of verbal support that I was getting from such people and virtually no checks being written. Very, very weird. On the other side, things that have gone faster. Well, I think the best example that we can talk about here is the crosstalk between different types of damage. So as I mentioned, there are really 7 different categories of damage that we need to focus on, each of which is a necessary component of all of this. We have to fix all of these types of damage or else we're going to die more or less on schedule. But they talk to each other. In other words, if you can repair one kind of damage, then you somewhat slow down the rate at which the other types of damage accumulate, even if you're not directly attacking those other types of damage yet. And the magnitude of that crosstalk seems to be larger than I would have predicted even only a couple of years ago. Specifically, the people who are working on elimination of senescent cells, such as this company Unity Biotechnology that I mentioned earlier, are seeing much broader, much more wide-ranging effects than I would have predicted. And that, of course, is hugely good news. It means that we can get away with doing a less perfect job on the comprehensive damage repair. Less comprehensiveness will still be enough to give substantial perpetuation of usefulness and good health.
If you play back the all those conversations you've had with people that could fund you, and if you abstract the people who didn't like you for whatever reason, and you think, why do you think they didn't write the checks?
Well,
unbelievability.
Yeah. So the thing about asking people for money is, if someone does give you money, then they're very happy to tell you why they gave you the money. But if someone doesn't give you money, they will almost never tell you why they didn't give you the money. So you have to do a lot of guessing, right? But yeah, I mean, sometimes, of course, people just felt that this was just too implausible. It just couldn't happen. Some people might have felt that, it was plausible, but we were the wrong team, that we didn't look like we could execute. Some people back in the day when the industry did not exist, when it was only a non-profit thing, they just, don't like charities. They think they don't work. Everything under the sun.
Do you feel like in the near term, there's going to be what I might call a man on the moon type of a moment where some discovery happens and all of a sudden people say, oh, now I get it. Now I know what Aubrey was talking about.
Actually, yes, I do think there's going to be such a tipping point. And furthermore, I think it's going to be a very sudden one because it's going to be driven by the publicly stated opinions of a very small number of people. If you think about it, the field of the biology of aging is a highly technical scientific field. Basically, everybody knows how much they don't know. They know that they need to respect the opinions of people who know more than them. And if you go up to the top of that food chain, you're talking about really only less than a dozen people worldwide who are, number one, real experts on the biology of aging, and number two, willing to actually go out on stage and on camera and say what they think, or at least say what they are willing to say. Now, that's an important distinction, because out of all of those dozen people, I am the only one who is in a position to actually tell it like it is. I'm the only one who does not rely for their funding on keeping other people happy, peer review of my next grant application, things like that. And, avoiding being accused of saying anything irresponsible or getting people's hopes up unjustifiably, that kind of nonsense. So there's an enormous bias on the part of my other esteemed colleagues in favor of being pessimistic and curmudgeonly. But, of course, all of those people are following the actual scientific advances that are occurring all over the world just as closely as I'm following them. And that means that there will come a point when one or two little breakthroughs are made that only get initially the same amount of press that breakthroughs in the biology of aging get every week in the press. Everything is always overhyped in this area. But among the expert community, they will be recognized as decisive in the sense of making it just unreasonable to carry on saying that this can't be done, or at least that this can't be done in the foreseeable future. And when my colleagues, the Harvard professors and so on, start coming out and saying more or less the same thing that I have been saying for the past 15 years, then complete pandemonium is going to ensue very quickly indeed. What's going to happen is that literally the following day, Oprah Winfrey is going to get out there and she's going to be saying, well, if this is only a matter of time, then we really kind of have a moral obligation to make it a little less time and put some proper effort into this. And the day after that, exactly what you described is going to happen. It's going to be impossible to get elected unless you have a manifesto commitment to have an absolute war on aging. Game over.
Do you imagine what is that? What is that event? I'm trying to.
So that's the interesting thing. The event is going to be in the lab. It's not going to be, someone waking up at the age of 90 and looking like they're 40. It's not going to be clinical trial. It's going to happen much sooner than that. I believe that all we're going to need is the ability to rejuvenate mice. And when I say rejuvenate, I mean actually literally. I mean take mice that are already, let's say, 2/3 of the way through their normal lifespan, and they've had exactly nothing done to them until that point, and then do a whole bunch of things to them all at the same time and allow them to live in a healthy, youthful way for another year or two on top of the time they would normally live. At the moment, the best you can do if you start in middle age, in the way I was describing it, you can get a couple of months, maybe 4 months if you're lucky. If you could get 2 years, that would be the point where my colleagues would say, okay, this is proven. And I believe that that's less than 5 years away from now. I think, of course, it's science, so I could be wrong, but I think we have at least a 50-50 chance of getting there within 5 years.
You mentioned sort of a dozen people, and part of our audience loves to continue to follow other smart people like yourselves. Who would be some of the people that immediately come to mind that our audience should be paying attention to their research, their papers, their Twitter feed, etc.?
Well, first of all, paying attention to their research papers, you can't do that unless you're already a biologist, because these are highly technical things. But paying attention to what they say on Twitter or on camera or whatever is kind of what I'm telling you not to do. I'm saying that at the moment, these people are not really saying the truth because they politically can't. And that will change suddenly in the next few years.
Okay, so who are the other radicals that we should pay attention to?
Well, actually, you shouldn't do that either, because the people who are, with as I say, the sole exception of...
It's just Aubrey. We just pay attention to Aubrey. That's
pretty much, yeah, because the point is... I mean, seriously, because the people who are saying the kind of things I say are saying it because they can get away with it. And with the exception of me, the only reason they can get away with it is because they're not in the field in the first place. They are just commentators, right? So if you want someone who is both expert and, free of the constraints that experts normally labor under, in any field, you're not going to find many people in that intersection. And in this field, I'm pretty much the only one.
Based on all your research in anti-aging, what have you changed in your own personal lifestyle to live longer?
Yeah, people ask me that a lot. Well, I don't accept seminar invitations to dangerous countries. I check the brakes on my bicycle a bit more carefully than I used to. But no, seriously, I am actually mainly focused on things like that, on avoiding accidental death, anytime soon. Because, first of all, I'm only 55. And secondly, I'm a very young 55. I happen to be kind of just lucky, well-built. My biological age, as measured by lots of different ways, is really, really, young. I'm come out like 10 or 15 years younger than I actually am, typically. So for me, it's a kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I pay close attention to my body, but nothing's going wrong yet, or even showing any early signs of going wrong. So I'm not really a good example of this. Of course, the other reason I'm not a good example is I don't get nearly enough sleep because I'm traveling all the time, getting the message out and hastening the defeat of aging. And, that's definitely bad for me.
Do you believe in this biological age component?
Well, sure. I mean, we can define the concept of biological age in the abstract very easily. We can say that one's biological age is simply the amount of damage that one is carrying around, the amount of damage that one's body has so far done to one in the course of living. But of course, that's a little bit abstract because then one has to ask, well, how do one measure the biological age? And it turns out that that's not easy because there are lots of different types of damage, and some of them are much harder to measure than others. So one ends up measuring a bunch of proxies that seem to be correlated with this or that. And that's okay, it's approximate, but it's better than nothing.
Where did you do your biological age testing?
So I've actually been very fortunate to be tested for free 5 times in the past 16 years, I guess, at the real high-end clinics that normally would charge like $10,000. One of the places doesn't exist anymore. It was called Kronos, Kronos, out in Scottsdale, Arizona. And most recently, I've done it with Terry Grossman at his clinic in Denver, Colorado. In both cases, they measure 150 different things in your blood, everything that changes with age. They measure a whole bunch of physiological tests, cognitive tests, you name it. And they put it all together into a package that not only comes out with a number of how biologically old you are, but also you get all the details so you can drill down depending on how much you understand about it, and figure out more.
Do you have a sense or an opinion on the work of Inside Tracker, which has sort of brought this down to what I would say even more of a consumerized level, even if it doesn't have quite the fidelity? Is this a useful measure?
Oh, for sure. I mean, all of these things, whether it's at the level of, Fitbit or, everything from there on up, everything that gives people more information about their health, both how their health is changing over the years and also how it's responding to changes in lifestyle or diet or exercise or whatever. All of these things are definitely useful. Of course, you have to have some intelligence about how to use the information. But at the end of the day, that's really just an extension of what I always say when people say, what can I do today other than give you money? I say, pay attention to your own body, because every individual is different. No generic advice makes sense because generic advice is too generic. And it's best just to pay attention to what works for you.
You mentioned very quickly about being able to do something about all of this before you were born. Could you go back and expand on that?
Well, actually, no, I didn't mention that. And the reason I didn't is because I don't think that prenatal anti-aging technology has much of a future. The reason I don't think it has much of a future is simply because aging is too slow for that. If we think about what we are comparing here, what we're saying is you've got the option of doing some kind of genetic modification in the sperm or eggs of the parents of someone who's going to be born versus waiting until that person has been born and actually has reached the age of, let's say, 50, and then doing stuff then to the body as it is already at that point. Now, the thing is, it is much harder to make modifications, genetic modifications, to people who are already alive, but at the same time, our ability to make such modifications is improving every year. So the cumulative amount of improvement that will have happened over a period of 50 years is, in my view, certain to way exceed the difference in difficulty that exists between the two technologies.
If you were speaking to a parent of a 10-year-old and saying, if you want your kids to live the longest, best life they can, do these things, would you have advice for them?
Sure. The advice would be give me large amounts of money so that I can get the research done faster. I mean, seriously, I wish that were a joke, but it isn't. The fact is, at the moment, the entire range of things available to people today to do, whatever age they are, whether it's supplements or diet or lifestyle changes or anything, is pretty much entirely ineffective. I mean, of course, you can shorten your life by, smoking or getting seriously overweight or having a very, unbalanced diet or whatever. But as long as you basically just do what your mother told you, you're done. We can't significantly improve upon that. Which means that the only thing that can be done is to hasten, to improve anyone's chances of making the cut, so to speak, of getting to the point where aging is medically history, is to hasten that date. And, of course, whether it's your kids who are 10 years old or whether it's you that are 40 years old, there's still a probability there. This is pioneering technology. We don't know how soon it's going to come along. I think we have a 50-50 chance of getting these developments to a really comprehensive level, a really decisive level of comprehensiveness within the next 18 years or so. But that's just a 50-50 chance. I think there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years. So, every increment, every little bit that you can do to bring this forward improves your own chances as well as your kids' chances or your parents' chances.
Your background, which I thought was fascinating, is computer science to biology to being a founder and obviously evangelist for this category. When you look at the companies that you're investing in or starting, are you seeing a different kind of founder coming from a more computer science angle or math angle versus a biology chemistry angle?
Yeah, no, not really. Certainly I have found among the community, the group of people that support us financially or get involved in one way or another, that there's a great deal of overrepresentation of IT people. Yes, people with that kind of background. I think they just get it more easily that this is just damage. They understand what I'm saying when I talk about what aging is and what the common sense approach to doing something about it might be. They just get it. But when it comes to CEOs, no, I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, of course, there's a wide range out there, but mostly they have biology training. In general, it's been, pretty much normal biology training. It's just that they haven't been, brainwashed into thinking that aging is some kind of natural phenomenon that's off limits for medicine, the way that most people do.
If you think about the books that you've read, movies you've seen, science fiction oriented, which ones do you think most represent the future you believe is going to happen? Like I can imagine a Gattaca, I can imagine a lot of Neil Stephenson's work.
Yeah, well, you can stop imagining right now because basically my answer to this is they're all basically hopeless. And they've got worse over the years, especially movies. Really old science fiction writing like Heinlein, for example, was reasonably positive. But, people who are just not such good writers tend to find that the only way they can introduce dramatic element into their storylines is by starting out with some kind of completely unjustified dystopic assumption. So, of course, we have the classic cases of things like Logan's Run or In Time, where somehow or other there is this assumption that we're going to have completely unmanageable overpopulation unless we kill people off on purpose, and that you can make a story out of that somehow or other, that kind of thing. It's extremely problematic to me because, of course, it makes my job a lot harder. People go to these movies kind of because they want to carry on putting aging out of their minds and getting on with their miserably short lives rather than, getting emotionally invested in it and getting their hopes up. And they come out of the movie theatre with that kind of attitude more entrenched, and making it that much more difficult for me to get people to see that now is the time to be aiming high. So, of course, some movies and some books are better than others, but honestly, the whole genre is a complete clusterfuck. I think I'm going to say that.
Love it. Love it. If our listeners did want to continue to read about this broad category, obviously your work is there. Are there one or two books that you'd recommend? Are there one or two podcasts you'd recommend? Places where people can continue to get more knowledge about the broader categories of aging, if not the narrower categories of senescence?
Sure. I wrote my own book, of course, about 11 years ago now, Ending Aging, it's called, and it's still pretty good. A lot of stuff has happened since then, but the progress that has been made is very much the progress that we predicted. So the book is still very relevant, and, we still have the same kind of paradigm for how to deal with aging. Beyond that, our website, SENS.org, is extremely informative. It's got material written for absolutely everybody, from complete novices all the way up to proper experts. And it discusses absolutely our own work, but also every other aspect of what's going on in the field right now and other people's work that is highly relevant and highly promising. So it's very much a very good source of information. Beyond that, it doesn't hurt to go and see a few of the talks that I've done over the years. There's rather a lot of me on YouTube, so that's one place to start. Really, it's not hard to find the right material now.
You've coined the term pro-aging trance. What is that?
So that's a term that I coined a long time ago now, more than 15 years ago, when I realized that the sheer irrationality, the insane irrationality underpinning the challenges that I was receiving with regard to whether we ought to be doing this, whether the defeat of aging was a good idea, could only be explained by people being hypnotized. I saw a very great similarity between how irrational they were and the experience that I had as an undergraduate when I went to a stage hypnotist show and somebody was convinced, was made to believe by the hypnotist something that wasn't true, and was then asked questions about his false belief, and the explanations of the paradoxes that were being presented to him were just completely crazy, but he was completely not realizing that they were crazy and was just giving these ridiculous explanations with a straight face. I thought that I was seeing the same sort of thing when I was being challenged as to whether we ought to be bringing aging under medical control.
Well, Aubrey, thank you for doing so much work in this space, for continuing to be an evangelist and organize all of us behind it. And I appreciate you both joining us on the podcast today and all the work you're going to do in the future.
Well, you're very kind. It's been my pleasure.
You've been listening to another episode of How to Live to 200. Thank you so much for joining me and exploring this world together. I get a ton of help from the L200 crew that includes Lauren Krayinsky and Kevin Kirkpatrick. The theme music is composed by Emmett McCann. Yes, that's my nephew. You can learn more about this and other episodes at our website, livingto200.com, or find us on Twitter or Instagram at howtolivето200, where we post lots of photos of cool things. It's early days for this podcast, so we would appreciate any and all comments or telling a friend or two about what we're doing over here. It might be irresponsible for you to keep it a secret. Until next time, eat right, get lots of sleep, keep good numbers, and be looking around the corner for the next big breakthrough. If we're going to live a long time, we better do it well.